We have got to raise the minimum wage to a living wage, and what we are here today to say is that living wage is $15 an hour.
A bill to raise the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour was passed by the U.S. House of Representatives and is now being discussed in the Senate. While political analysts are saying that the bill probably won't be passed this year, it's likely an issue that Congress will continue to face in the upcoming years. Each year that the minimum wage law isn't updated, the value of that wage drops. Take a look at this graph that plots the minimum wage value in 2018 dollars from 1980 to 2016, when the last minimum wage law in West Virginia was passed. Minimum wage must be constantly updated in order for minimum wage workers to be earning a consistent amount.
If the minimum wage is staying flat, but if prices are rising, then the amount of stuff that you can buy for the minimum wage is eroding over time.
Some states have recently tried to solve this issue by creating a law that requires an annual review of the minimum wage each year in correlation with the Consumer Price Index, which is what inflation is measured by. But in theory, a state that offers a competitive minimum wage could draw in more business.
You know, if we want to have a higher minimum wage in West Virginia, and we go just unilaterally and increase our minimum wage, but if the minimum wage in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Virginia stays where it was before, that may put us in a competitive disadvantage against our neighboring states, and there may be this kind of competition among states to avoid, you know, increasing minimum wages when kind of business activity can be drawn across the border. If this state has a higher minimum wage, that state doesn't. So to avoid that kind of competition between states or among states, it might be better to have a national minimum wage policy.
So the pros for minimum wage are self-explanatory. The wage boost is estimated to lift 1.3 million people out of poverty, according to the Congressional Budget Office. And for a state like West Virginia, where the cost of living is generally lower than the national average, a minimum wage bump to this size would be substantial.
Going from the market wage in San Francisco to $15 an hour may not be as big of a deal. It may not make as much of a difference compared to a place like West Virginia where the cost is much lower. So going from our market wage for low-skilled labor all the way up to 15 may make a much bigger difference, and it may have larger effects overall.
But that big of a raise in wages could be hard on small businesses who rely on minimum wage workers.
The biggest thing is with small businesses now and the internet and people being able to purchase stuff everywhere, business is already in dire straits. So the profit line is not like it used to be. So that would absolutely hurt, I know, my business and small businesses. And it's certainly not that my employees who are outstanding deserve it. But the business just doesn't make enough profit to afford that.
Have to make some decisions, you know, whether to continue the business or probably raise prices.
Inflation is one of the larger arguments against minimum wage laws. Because the cost of labor would rise, many companies would push the difference over to consumers and products would cost more.
It can lead to like a short-run jump in the overall price level in the economy when the minimum wage is increased. Although it's not going to lead to a sustained inflation like what we saw in the U.S. in the 1970s, but it certainly can lead to a bump in inflation in the short run.
There are many things to take into account when we're talking about inflation, and minimum wage is one of them. But it also has to do with the value of the U.S. dollar, tariffs, taxes, and other factors. If we look at this graph of minimum wage boosts versus inflation, we can see that there are little bumps around the time that minimum wage policy is introduced. But it appears that minimum wage seems to have a smaller influence overall. The Raise the Wage Act being discussed by U.S. senators right now would gradually raise the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour by 2025. The federal minimum wage is currently only $7.25, and the last time it was raised was in 2009. For WBOY.com, I'm Sheila Klein in Morgantown.